Hello, today I wanted to talk about the changeability of Egyptian mythology and culture because, like Ma'at, this is something that a lot of people who are new to the study of Egyptology and Egyptian history and religion tend to get a little confused about. Because with most religions, especially the most popular three these days, you kind of have a set idea of how things happen and what the stories are. There's very little argument about the big idea of it. There can be argument about the details of certain people's lives that are related to the religion, but the big details are usually not that argued about. The core concept to understand about Egyptian religion is that it changed drastically over the years. It belonged to a civilization that lasted so long, of course, that these changes were almost inevitable. And not only did they change over time period, but they changed over location as well. So, to demonstrate the vast history of the Egyptian civilization, I want to look at the age of the most popular religions that our culture as a world dedicate ourselves to today. So, for example, we have Islam, which is the youngest Abrahamic religion that is popularly practiced today. Islam was kind of started in 571 AD, I believe, when the Prophet Muhammad was born. That means that Islam has only been around for about 1400 years, or 1400 years. Then we have Christianity, which began, of course, with the birth of Jesus Christ. And people only really started to worship Jesus, as far as I know, kind of after he died and was resurrected. But although that happened about 30 years after 0 AD, since that's how we count our years, let's just say that it started about 2,000 years ago. And so Christianity is 2,000 years old, Islam is 1,400 years old, and so that's how long they've been around in the modern era. But Egyptian religion was around for a long, long time. If we're counting religion only from the time that Narmer united Egypt into one cohesive country, then the religion was around for 3,100 years. However, it's pretty obvious that the religion of Egypt predates its first unification that we know of. And so I'd say that Egyptian religion as a concept within the peoples of the Nile Valley was probably there since at least 6000 BC. The last temple in Egypt was closed in 537 AD, meaning that if you decide to count Egyptian religion starting in 6000 BC, that would make the time span of Egyptian religion 6,500 years. That's really old. Humans have a changeable nature. And so does the culture that they belong to. Yes, there are traditions that date back many, many thousands of years, but there are a lot of things that change in those traditions as well, small details and things like that. And you can definitely see that in Egyptian religion as well. The mythology of the Ptolemaic period is going to be quite different from the mythology of the Old Kingdom, especially the cosmology that they believed in. To track the difference in myths across the different cities, I think it's best to look at creation myths, because that's what differs the most clearly when you look at Egyptian history. Most creation myths kind of stick to a similar theme, and one thing that they seem to all have in common is that before the world there was Nun, which is the primordial chaotic waters of potential creation that kind of was just everything and nothing all at once. From that comes some sort of demiurge, and the demiurge in one way or another creates the inhabited world and its inhabitants. In Heliopolis you have Atum-Re, who births Shu and Tefnut either from his spit, or from masturbating. And then in Memphis, you have the Memphite theology, and while that's a bit of a argued subject, the basis of it is genuinely what they probably believed, where you have the god Ptah, who speaks the world into creation. The thing about Ptah is that it's much more speech-based rather than physical-based. Then further south, you have the city of Hermopolis, or Khmunu. And there you have the main deity being Thoth, or Jehuti. In that creation myth, you actually have 8 primordial deities, and this is called the Ogdoad. The Ogdoad is made up of Nun and his feminine counterpart Naunet, Chech and his feminine counterpart Chechet, Kek, his feminine counterpart Keket, and then Amun and Amunet. From these 8 primordial deities, an egg was created, and from that egg hatched what is known as the Great Cackler, or Negegwer, or something like that. That's just the Egyptological pronunciation of it, but it's basically a big goose. But it's also known that this was probably Jehuti, or Juhuti is referenced directly as being the one who hatched from this primordial egg. Then, from after his hatching, Thoth creates the world. This can be changed somewhat over time periods. Originally, it was Thoth in the earlier periods. However, as Egypt became kind of more unified and things started to get meshed together, and it became kind of clear which gods were kind of more dominant in being worshipped, the Heliopolitan texts often refer to Atum creating the world, despite using the framework of the Hermopolitan creation myth. Even further south in Thebes, you have Montu originally as the main god that was worshipped. However, after the Theban kings took over after the first intermediate period, I believe, they took the god Amun from the Ogdoad and elevated him to be their main patron deity of the city. In this way, Amun absorbed a majority of the traits from Montu. Yet further south, between Thebes and Aswan, you have the city of Esna. And at Esna, you have the temple of Khnum. And in the Temple of Khnum, you have a wonderful series of texts detailing Neith, the goddess, as a creator. I found a very good translation of this online, which is really nice, so I'm just going to read a little bit of it. So column 13, it says, "She, Neith, is in his protection every day. Neith, the beginning who made eternity. Neith is the first goddess who creates." And then column 4, you have words spoken by Neith, the great mother of God, lady of Esna, who began existence in the beginning, she who are from Nun, while the earth was in darkness and illuminated the two lands with the rays of her eye, she who makes food for everybody. And then in column 2, you have her labeled as Lady of Eternity, Ruler of Eternity, who made heaven, earth, and the netherworld. And so this sounds, of course, a whole lot like she was the demiurge of Esna. Khnum comes into play because obviously this is his temple, and Khnum comes into play in the way that he creates humans and creatures on his potter's wheel. He is a god of pottery in a way. In fact, his wheel is supposedly said to remake the cosmos every morning. So he has almost a Khepri type role to play in reinvigorating the cycle of day and night every single day. So from this we can see, all the way from Heliopolis or Iunu down to Esna and probably down to Aswan, but I didn't research that far, there were a lot of creation myths throughout Egypt. And these are just the creation myths, of course. So that doesn't even get into myths like the wandering goddess, the contendings of Horus and Set. It doesn't get into the rampaging of Sekhmet or the book of the heavenly cow. And these things, although they might have been first recorded in, for example, the New Kingdom or the late period, it's likely that they had not remnants, but origins in earlier time periods that simply weren't written down, haven't been found yet, or have been destroyed since they were created. In fact, for example, the Book of the Heavenly Cow is thought to have origins in the Middle Kingdom. So why am I talking about this? Well, it's because it tends to confuse people, mainly when they ask about the god Set. Set is a very interesting god, because in Egyptian religion, there are the forces of Ma'at and the forces of Isfet. Isfet is chaos, Ma'at is order and balance and harmony. And when you encounter myths regarding Set, it seems that he's a force of Isfet. And so, if Isfet is something that is deplorable to Kemetics and to ancient Egyptians, then why would you worship Set, who seems to be a pretty good incarnation of Isfet? Well, the thing is that people kind of get this idea of Set from a specific myth called the Contendings of Horus and Set, which I believe was written in the Ptolemaic period, or at least the late period. It's gone through a lot of changes since it was first conceived. And now, the Contendings of Horus and Set are nowadays being thought of in the framework of a historical story that was then converted into a myth. This being the story of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. The Upper Egypt belonging to Set, and Lower Egypt belonging to Horus. They had a battle, and Egypt was unified under Horus. And some scholars believe that this is actually a reference to the kings of these cities of northern and southern Egypt. Much of the myths that people read today are also heavily inspired by the writings of Herodotus. Herodotus is one of those Greek historians who went to Egypt and recorded a lot of what he saw. However, again, this was during the Ptolemaic era in 430 BC, so they're going to be quite different from what they might have been in the past. And not only that, but Herodotus is kind of known for making stuff up sometimes, so his accounts aren't completely reliable. But Set is not just a manifestation of Isfet. In fact, he's not really a manifestation of Isfet at all. What I see a lot of modern Comedics comparing him to is the force of change that creates room for growth and for Ma'at in the future. So, for example, if Osiris was king forever, there would be no room for growth. Horus wouldn't ascend to kinghood because there was already a king on the throne. So when Set murders Osiris, he's actually making room for growth. Yes, there is the temporary Isfet that comes with the vacant throne, but there is still that ability to move forward in the timeline. A lot of people also tend to compare Set to a forest fire, which burns down a forest to make room for new growth. And I think that that's kind of apt. Set is not only the god who killed Osiris, his brother, and attempted to usurp the throne from his nephew Horus. Set is also one of the gods that protects Ra on the solar bark each day and night from the serpent Apep, which is a much more distinct manifestation of Isfet. Apep is literally the coming together of all evils. And it's very different from Set, because Set is a force of good in some occasions. Some cities worship Set as their main god. So when you hear about a myth that has something maybe a little weird in it that doesn't seem to match with other things that you've read, it's likely that it came from a specific place, and that the myths that you're reading might come from a different place. There are, for example, a lot of variations considering why Set might have murdered his brother Osiris. A very popular one, of course, is that Set was just jealous and wanted to murder his brother so that he could take the throne, and then Horus happened to be born after Osiris died, and so Set had to battle him for the throne. However, there are also variations of the myth where Osiris actually sleeps with Set's wife. Set is actually avenging and returning his own honor and his wife's honor by killing Osiris. And so those are two very different variations of the same myth, and just kind of a small detail is changed, or just a small amount of information is added to make it seem much more like Set is the good guy who's in the right and completely justified for his actions. Another thing that kind of showcases that Egyptian religion was not really one cohesive religion is that in most temples across Egypt, the main god of the temple is referred to as the greatest god that has ever lived. So for example, in the Temple of Khonsu in Thebes, you have titles of Khonsu being the greatest god who ever lived. In the temples of Ptah in Memphis, you have titles of Ptah saying that he is the greatest god who ever lived. And if you're gonna put things in this kind of a comparison of greatest ever, then there can really only be one logically. But the thing is, again, Egyptian religion had many different sects. And in fact, in my opinion, according to what I've read and according to the opinions of some other scholars, there were actually kind of two main Egyptian religions, the solar and the chthonic. That's a bit of a complex subject to get into right now, but if you want to read more, I would highly recommend Sylvia Zago's book, The Diachronic Evolution of the Duat, I think it's called. You should be able to find it by looking at that, and I'll put it in the description as well if I can. But it does a very good deep dive into the way that the Duat, or the underworld, or just the afterlife of the ancient Egyptians, evolved and changed over time. And by looking at this evolution, it becomes so clear that ancient Egyptian religion was, number one, not static, and not really one religion. It was a lot of different sects who believed in some core values, for example, Ma'at, the beginning of the world being Nun, the regeneration of the solar cycle, and different things about ancestor worship and the sacredness of the pharaoh. So those are some of the main things that unite the different beliefs of ancient Egypt, of course. But there are so many different ways of looking at the Egyptian gods that it doesn't make sense to group it all into one extremely cohesive religion. And one of the main reasons for that as well is that there was no Bible written for ancient Egyptian religion. There's no one main text. There are a lot of different scattered texts that scholars, archaeologists, Egyptologists have to piece together very, very carefully to create even a somewhat cohesive image of ancient Egyptian religion, which is just very different from religions like Christianity and Islam and Judaism that have very specific holy books that are accepted and are law. One of the main reasons, actually, that I made this video was that I got a comment on my video to Ma'at talking about Nephthys, or Nebtchet, saying that she's basically, that this commenter doesn't understand her role, because in some cases she's shown to be fraternizing with Osiris and cheating on her husband, and in other cases she's shown to be helping Isis rebuild Osiris so that he can live again in the afterlife. And I think that I kind of answered this basically in the video by saying that, well, Egyptian religion is just super changeable. And different places are going to have different ideas of the gods, of the same god. And of course, that idea of a god is going to change over time. So I'm not going to dive too deeply into Nephthys herself, because this video isn't really about that. But because she's another example, a little bit like Set, where people aren't quite sure, like, oh, is she trustworthy? Is she moral? Well, she's a goddess. She's very, very much tied to hegemony and the material world, of course, and so because she has had a presence in the material world, that means that she's had the opportunity to do some bad things, just like humans. But it really depends on what you want to believe about her, because again, the Egyptians wrote these myths in order to kind of understand their own world and to act as a sort of representation for what they know and what they see. Nephthys herself, most people would see her absolutely, most ancient Egyptian people would see her as a very positive force. She is kind of considered the darkness to Isis's light. So Nephthys, very much connected to Isis, very much can be worshipped as a positive influence. I don't think it's possible to worship her as a negative influence. But what I'm basically trying to say is that, like most gods and goddesses in Egypt, Nephthys has negative aspects and positive aspects. Not every god is like this, but most of them are. For example, the goddess Nut that I mentioned earlier, she's sometimes referred to as a sow who eats her piglets. A sow is a female pig. And in some of the later myths and stories, Geb is shown to be deriding her and chastising her because it's wrong, obviously, to eat your own children. However, Ra steps in and says, hey, well, this is obviously a paraphrase, but he says, hey, Geb, you know that Nut eating her children is necessary for the cycle of life, regeneration, and rebirth to be possible. And so, although this action is kind of almost cruel in a way, because Nut has to eat Ra, the sun disk, in order to rebirth him every morning. So basically, this process is necessary, although it might be considered evil. It is also necessary to effectuate regeneration throughout the world. So again, we're kind of faced with the concept that we had with Set, where someone who enacts something that we consider to be kind of evil is actually effectuating movement and regeneration in the world. And this kind of relates back to, again, Apep. And so people say, okay, so what Set does is kind of like Isfet, and, you know, eating your children is Isfet. How is this different from Apep's Isfet? Why should I be able to worship Nut or Set if they do these things? Well, Apep's Isfet is obviously different. Apep is a being, a manifestation of Isfet, whose goal is just to destroy everything and return it to Nun. There is no goal of regeneration. There is no remaking the world in his own image. There is just destruction and returning to Nun. So obviously that's very different from the types of actions that are taken by gods like Set. So I hope this is at least somewhat illuminating about Egyptian religion in general. Because again, this is one of those things that I see a lot of beginners and people just asking about, like, oh, why did this god do this? Why does this myth say this? When I don't think that they would have done something like that. Well, it's probably because it's from a different city or a different time period. Again, I would highly recommend reading Sylvia Zago's thesis. It is absolutely amazing, really descriptive, and pretty easy to read as long as you have a basic understanding of Egyptian religion. You're going to be able to see the evolution of how ancient Egyptians perceived of the afterlife in the Old Kingdom during the Pyramid Text, all the way up into the New Kingdom in the late period with the different books of the dead and the just huge corpus of funerary literature, and the way it changed, and the juxtaposition between the chthonic religion and the celestial religion. The chthonic religion being more related to Osiris, and the celestial religion being more related to the rebirth of Ra. Because both of these gods, Ra and Osiris, both undergo a regeneration of some sort and a rebirth. For Ra, it happens daily. For Osiris, it's a one-time thing. But it's still something that ancient Egyptians, especially pharaohs, would have connected themselves to in order to be renewed and rebirthed like those gods. But which god they decided to go with kind of depends on the time period and the trends of the time, whether the solar cult or the Osirian cult was more popular. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, just go ahead and leave them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them. I will also put some sources in the description so that you guys can do some further reading, because I don't want you to just rely on people on YouTube talking to you about stuff. That's not smart. But I wanted to be able to share a bit of a short description explaining why Egyptian religion is so confusing. A lot of people find themselves confused when they first start looking into it. I did for a long time. So, anyway, I hope you have a good day.